Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Reconvene to public session at 7:02 p.m. And if we would stand, salute the flag, and have a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Recommend approving tonight's agenda as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh. So approved. Recommend the approval of the minutes of the Board of Education regular meeting of January the 24th. First, Mrs. Pugh.
Second.
Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Okay, next we have special guest, Mr. Jason Rogers. This is the All-State Band and Sussex County Honor Band students.
President Hitchens, would you like to?
We're confused here, or were you gonna do that?
I was. It's okay. We'll do it twice.
Okay, go ahead.
Hey, everybody. We're very fortunate tonight to have Mr. Jason Rogers with us.
Yes.
And also our All-State Band and Sussex County Honors Band. We have some awards for you, but before that, Mr. Rogers, would you like to take the spot?
Okay, well, every year we go through a process of getting ready for an audition, you know what, these kids accepted the challenge, which I'm extremely pleased, because sometimes whenever you announce that to your class, you have people run and cower, because you're playing for judges, you're getting evaluated, and you're going up against, maybe in Claude's situation, people from all around the state, or all around the county, and that is high pressure. So I really got to hand it to these guys. They accepted the challenge, and they came through, and it's awesome. So I'm very proud of them.
Were they evaluated individually or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Really?
Did you have to audition?
Yeah, the audition.
Okay, so we first have, for All-State Band, Claude Jean Louis. And he'll be playing percussion.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
For Sussex County Senior Honors Band, Susan Shahid, she'll be playing flute. Again, Senior Honors Band, Kamari Houchins on mallets. And we have Claude again for Senior Honors Band percussion. Rachel Singh for Junior Honors Band for clarinet. Lorraine Slaby for clarinet for Junior Honors Band. Elizabeth Quinn for Junior Honors Band for trumpet. Devin Byers, Junior Honors Band for trumpet. And Josie Cruz for Junior Honors Band baritone.
How about one more round of applause?
Thank you.
You get the board come up with the picture.
Keep it whole. Mama's one your chairman.
You start to sit there, didn't you?
That's tough to do, standing for you.
Thank you.
I'm telling you.
See you guys, congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, next we will have board participation. Mr. Nichols?
I can't think of much else than our wrestling team. These guys here, I think they're in local camps now. There's
Southern Division.
Southern Division, well, 10 open, isn't it?
And Open Southern Division, is it?
They are the Henlopen Conference Southern Division champions, third straight year.
So I'm rather proud of them. We've got some potential state champs too. They're still going that way. So we'll just wait and see. I'm right proud of the wrestling team. I remember some years ago, our wrestling team consisted of 5 guys, and the rest of it was boys. And now our wrestling program here in Laurel has gotten substantially better, and I'm very proud of these guys. I'm good.
Ms. Isler?
Well, good evening, everyone, and it's just good to be able to not be snowed in and it being freezing outside, all those things. And it's also just good to know that we have great things that are continuing to happen in our district. And I just want to send a shout of thanks out to everyone in every aspect that helped to make those things happen.
Thank you. Okay, next, I was going to say what Mr. Nichols had said about the wrestlers. Also, this week is the FFA week.
Oh, yes,
Correct.
it is.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, and Susan had shared with us in executive on the Secretary of Education was here today and met with every bus driver and talked with them. And then who was the other person that was the head of?
Tyler Bryan.
He's the education associate for
Transportation.
the state.
Okay. Normally, we don't get the Secretary of Education down here in Sussex County. So I don't know what Susan did to get him down here, but he came here.
There wasn't a gun
So
involved.
that was good. That was good. Mrs. Pugh. Ditto.
Okay, I'm sorry that Dan left. I just wanted to say that, I go to all the football games, and I think every away game I go to, I hear someone talk about our band. And they.
Very good.
Jason does an excellent job, and we
Yes.
should really be proud of that.
Yes.
And I just want to say good luck to the wrestling team. And I want to mention that one of our teachers, Mrs. Melanie Story, was awarded the VFW Delaware Teacher of the Year.
Cool.
This year. Yeah, it was kind of an under the radar thing, because her husband didn't share it.
Yeah.
But yeah, she won that award this week.
Very good.
Congratulations to her.
And with that, because I too just found out about this, with that, I think all knows about it, Madison Callaway won a Youth Essay Award for VFW, and so did Sanaya Lindsay. Is that right? Yeah.
Nice.
Fantastic.
So we'll get all that stuff published out there. I'm sure you've already got it on LMS, but the district will get it out there tomorrow.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, public participation. I have no one that has signed up to speak. So we will move right along to reports, financial report.
And while Mrs. Horsey's making her way up there, I don't want to leave the boys' basketball team out. Have they made the
Oh, yes.
tournament, or do we know yet? Yeah, they're very, very close to making the tournament.
All
Very
right, good
good.
job, boys.
And they had a great game the other night, double overtime at Lake Forest.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Just some accomplishments from our last meeting. Our academic excellence report was submitted, and our mental health report and our opportunity fund report was posted to our website. Also, our financial position report was submitted. We completed the mid-year unit count as of February 1st. So our total enrollment from September 30th overall went down by 2. And that's comprised of regular education, which went up by 23, and our special education students that went down by 25. Some things we have coming up, our next CBOC meeting is on March 11th, and we have a GEAR report due on March 29th, that's due to federal grants. Our ESSER annual report is due by April 30th. And we have a Filter First funding report due May 1st, and our next financial position report also due May 1st. And here's a look at our reserve and local fund balance as compared to the same time last year. We're running right on track with comparable ups and downs. So, any questions regarding finances?
Anyone? Mrs. Pugh? No? No, thank you.
I shared with the board earlier that we will have a 3- and 5-year finance and facilities report coming soon, that Mrs. Horsey and Mr. Downs from facilities is going to be heading up with the input of everybody, but they're going to be heading up that report, a 3-year short-term, 5-year long-term.
Okay, thank you. Unfinished business, the second reading. Recommend second reading of policy GBEE, electronic communication and social media policy, as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy was available for review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the second reading of policy GCFB, minimum age requirement policy, as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy was available for review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh. Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the second reading of policy GBAA, staff conduct, harassment, or sexual misconduct toward students with addendum A, as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy was available for review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
So approved. School choice, recommend approval of school choice as a group.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh. And Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend the approval of school choice as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Fundraisers, recommend approval of fundraisers as a group. For Mr. Nichols, was that you?
Yeah.
First, Mr. Nichols, second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh,
Approved.
and Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of fundraisers as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh,
Second.
second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh,
Approved.
Mr. Nichols,
Approved.
and Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Rentals. Recommend to approve request of Josh Tucker, Route 1 Sports, for use of Laurel Middle High School athletic field and stadium to hold youth soccer camp beginning June 24th to June 27th, 2024, from 8:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. Participation fee of $175 to be charged. Certificate of liability insurance provided.
I recommend approval of use of facility fee applied and custodial fees waived.
Second.
Okay. First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh? So approved. Recommend to approve the request of Detective Ashley Gardner, Laurel Police Department, for use of Laurel Middle High School classroom, auditorium, and high school gymnasium to hold Junior Police Academy beginning August the 5th to August the 9th, 2024, from 7:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. No fee for participation. Certificate of liability insurance provided.
I recommend approval of use of facility fee and custodial fees waived.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh? So approved. Professional trips. Recommend approval of professional trips as a group.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh?
Second.
Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh? Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
So approved. Recommend approval of professional trips as submitted.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols?
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh?
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler?
Approved.
So approved. PSAT date, April the 11th, 2024 for freshmen. Request asynchronous instruction for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade students for April the 11th, 2024. Recommend to approve PSAT date, April 11, 2024 for freshmen. Request asynchronous instruction for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade students for April the 11th, 2024 as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler, second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler? Mr. Nichols?
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh? So approved. We have the first reading of policy EFQ, school meal payments and charges as submitted and found on the district website in the Board of Education policy section and as found at the law school district sites. This policy will be available for review by the community at the law school district buildings and on the district website. Community input is welcome and should be directed to the superintendent of schools no later than Tuesday, March 19, 2024. Action executive session items. Personnel A, professional. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment A.
So moved.
First, Mr. Nichols.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
And Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment B, support. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive sessions as listed in attachment B.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Pugh.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Isler. Roll call vote, Mrs. Pugh.
Approved.
Mrs. Isler. And Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
So approved. Personnel attachment C, coaches. Recommend to approve the personnel report with recommendations as discussed in executive session as listed in attachment C.
So moved.
First, Mrs. Isler.
Second.
Second, Mrs. Pugh. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
The regular board meeting scheduled for Wednesday, March 20th at 7 p.m. at Laurel Middle High School Cafe. Do I have a motion? We adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
First, Mrs. Isler. Second, Mr. Nichols. Roll call vote, Mrs. Isler.
Approved.
Mr. Nichols.
Approved.
And Mrs. Pugh. So approved. We adjourn at 7:21 p.m.